Okay, so here's the thing about this email. You've been staring at it for literally 4 minutes and you still haven't processed what you're reading. Because your brain keeps doing this thing where it goes, wait, no, that can't be right. And then you read it again and it is right. It absolutely is. And your brain just resets, refuses to accept it. It's a Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. You're at your desk. The office is doing its normal Tuesday afternoon thing. Keyboard, someone's meeting overrunning in the glass-walled conference room, the faint smell of someone's third coffee. And none of it matters like at all because your inbox just received an email that explains 2 years of your life in 4 paragraphs. 2 years of quietly bad performance reviews. 2 years of feeling like you were working harder than anyone around you and somehow being seen as the weakest person on the team. 2 years of watching promotions go to people you trained and wondering if something was wrong with you, not your skills, not your work, but you as a person, somehow fundamentally broken in a way that management could see but nobody would name. The email wasn't sent to you on purpose. That's the thing. That's what makes this whole situation so perfectly, specifically absurd. She meant to send it to your manager. You were CC'd on an earlier thread that she didn't realize was still active. She hit reply all. She typed out 2 paragraphs about the serious performance concerns she'd been quietly raising about you for 18 months. And your name was in the to field. You're reading a 2-year sabotage plan addressed to you by accident. We're going back to the beginning because this story doesn't start at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. It starts 2 years earlier in a conference room when you shook hands with a woman named Rachel and thought, genuinely, I think I'm going to like working with her. So honestly, the job was everything you'd been working toward. That's the part that's hard to talk about without sounding naive, but it's true. When you got the offer for senior account manager at Greystone Digital, you were genuinely embarrassingly excited. Like you called your mom before you even signed the contract. That kind of excited. You'd spent 5 years at smaller agencies getting really good at something specific. You knew how to build client retention programs that actually worked. Not the fluffy metrics for the deck kind. The kind where clients stayed because the value was real and they knew it. And Greystone was exactly the size and type of agency where that skill was going to matter. They had big clients, mid-tier retention rates, and a new VP of client services, your boss, Marcus Webb, who'd been brought in specifically to fix the retention problem. You were exactly what Marcus needed on his team, and Marcus knew it, and he made that clear in the interview in the kind of specific way that feels like, okay, this person actually read my resume. The team was small, 6 people in the client services function. Marcus at the top. You and Rachel as senior account managers. 3 mid-level AMs below you both. One coordinator, Priya, who was sharp enough that you figured she'd be running the department in 2 years. It was a tight team. The kind where you're in each other's business a lot just because the work requires it. Rachel had been at Greystone for 3 years when you arrived. She was good. You could see that immediately. She knew the clients, knew the internal processes, knew which vendors were reliable and which were going to be a headache. She was friendly when she showed you around on your first week, answered your questions without making you feel dumb for asking them, grabbed lunch with you on Thursday. You walked away from week 1 thinking, okay, solid teammate. This is going to work. Here's the thing about Rachel that you didn't understand yet. She'd been the best person on this team for 3 years. Not just good, the best. And Marcus's hire of you had, without anyone saying it out loud, restructured the implicit hierarchy of the department. You weren't her junior. You weren't going to learn from her and grow upward in her shadow. You were her peer, her equal, in a role where she'd been unchallenged for 3 years. You didn't know that mattered to her the way it did. You genuinely didn't clock it. You were just excited to work alongside someone good. So the first 6 months are great. Like genuinely great. You're firing on all cylinders. You've already redesigned the onboarding process for 3 of Greystone's top 10 clients, and one of them has already sent Marcus a note saying the service quality has noticeably improved. Marcus is happy. You're happy. The work is good. You feel like you made the right call taking this job. And then your 6-month review happens. And something's off. dramatically off. Nobody's sitting across from you saying we have serious concerns. It's subtler than that. Marcus is warm like he always is, and he highlights the wins because the wins are real. But there are these little moments. A comment about team integration that feels slightly vague when you ask him to clarify. A note about communication style that doesn't connect to any specific feedback you've received. Vague mention that some stakeholders have expressed some uncertainty about your approach to a particular client, which is news to you because the client in question just renewed at a higher contract value. You leave the review confused, not panicked. The overall tone was positive, just confused. There's this faint dissonance, like someone has been describing a slightly different version of you to Marcus, and that version is almost but not quite right. You tell yourself it's early. These things take time. You keep doing what you're doing. 12 months in, the review is harder to be breezy about. Communication challenges is now a full section. Collaboration gaps shows up for the first time. Marcus mentions carefully that some of the team has found your working style occasionally difficult to align with. You ask him specifically who and what specifically, and he deflects in that way managers deflect when they're repeating feedback they've been given but can't source. It's more of a general impression, he says. More of a pattern that's emerged. Pattern? From what? From who? You go back to your desk. You sit there for a while. And you do that thing you probably shouldn't do but can't help. You run back through the last year and try to find the version of yourself that's difficult to align with. You can't find it. You can find normal work friction. You can find the occasional disagreement about approach. But communication challenges, collaboration gaps, that's not what the work shows. That's not what the client outcomes show. You start to wonder if you're missing something about yourself, if you're genuinely difficult to work with in ways you can't perceive. You wonder if there's a blind spot, something real, something that people can see about you that you're not seeing. That's what 2 years of quietly bad feedback does to a person. It doesn't just make you question the feedback, it makes you question yourself. Okay, so here's the thing that starts to shift around month 14. You stop looking inward and you start looking inward and you start looking outward. Not because you have any specific suspicion yet, it's more like you've run out of self-analysis and there's nothing there, so you start paying attention to the environment instead. What you notice first is timing. Specifically, every time something goes right for you, a concern materializes in Marcus's language the next week. You land a particularly good client presentation, great feedback from the client, Marcus in the room, visible win, and the following Wednesday, Marcus asks you to walk him through your communication approach because he's had a few questions come up. You take on a new client who'd been struggling under a different AM, genuinely difficult client, and you handle them well, and the following Monday there's a note in your file about independent decision-making that may not align with team processes. You start keeping a log. Just to document your personal laptop time-stamped entries. Win minus management question. Good client outcome minus vague team friction report. You log 9 instances over the next 6 weeks. 9. And then there's the thing with Priya, the coordinator, the sharp one who you'd always figured was on her way up. You and Priya have been working well together on a client restructure, and she's good, like genuinely good, and one afternoon she mentions that Rachel had pulled her aside to ask if she was finding it hard to work with you. Priya had said no, she found it great. Rachel had seemed surprised. Priya tells you this almost like a throwaway, weird, right? And moves on, but you log it. Date and time. You've got a pattern. You don't have a proof. But you've got a pattern, and it's all pointing in one direction. Here's the thing about Rachel that you figure out slowly, and I mean slowly because she was genuinely good at this. Like, she had a system. It wasn't messy. It wasn't dramatic. It was so carefully structured that it took 2 years to notice because every individual piece of it looked like normal workplace noise. Here's how it worked. She had access to Marcus. Not unusual, they'd been working together for 3 years before you arrived, and that relationship gave her routine, easy, low-stakes communication with him. Coffee catch-ups, quick Slack messages. The kind of casual touch points that feel like nothing and build a real-time narrative over time. She used that access to plant ideas, not complaints. She wasn't filing formal grievances. That would have been too visible, too documentable. Instead, she'd drop observations, soft, concerned, framed as team health commentary. I've noticed our name tends to go around process sometimes. I wonder if that's something to address. A few of the junior team members mentioned they found your name a bit hard to read in meetings. Might be worth a conversation. I just want to make sure we're all aligned because I've been picking up some tension. None of this was provable. None of it was even specific enough to counter. It was just a constant low-grade signal being fed into the system. Your name is a problem. Your name causes friction. Keep an eye on your name. She also, and this is the one that genuinely gets you when you finally piece it together, she also worked on the clients. Not all of them, blatantly. But on shared accounts, she'd check in with clients about team communication and ask whether they had any feedback about their experience with the account management, which is a completely normal business practice. Except she'd frame it in a way that slightly invited concern. We're always looking to improve, combined with a particular listening expression and a slight pause after the question. Most clients said everything was fine. But occasionally someone would mention a small thing, a delayed response, a misunderstood brief, and Rachel would bring that back to Marcus as emerging client feedback about your performance. She was manufacturing a reputation. Over 2 years. Drip by drip. And she was doing it to protect her position in a department that she'd spent 3 years building before you showed up and made her, for the first time, have to share the top. The wild thing is, and this is the thing you come back to, she was still perfectly pleasant to your face. Not fake nice in a way you could point to. Professional. Collegial. She'd help you when you asked. She'd respond to your messages. She'd laugh at your jokes in the team meeting. She was so clean about it. That's what took the longest to accept, not that she did it, but that she did it while looking exactly like a normal colleague. You had the pattern, you knew who, you just needed proof, right? So, month 18. You've got a log with 23 entries, you've got Priya's comments saved, and you've got a gut feeling that by this point is basically screaming at you. But gut feelings don't go to HR. Paper trails do, so you build one, carefully, deliberately. And here's what that actually looks like, because people always talk about documentation like it's just write stuff down, and it's way more specific than that. First thing you do, you start BCCing yourself on every significant email. Not every email, that's paranoid and creates noise. The significant ones, client feedback emails, success decisions, anything where your reasoning, your communication, your approach is documented in a timestamped format that can't be altered later. Your personal email becomes a secondary archive that only you have access to. Same thing, you start copying the whole team on client updates that previously you could have handled bilaterally. This seems annoying, and it is slightly, but it has a specific function. It creates a visible group witness record of how you actually communicate with clients. Which means if there's ever a question about your communication style, there's a 100-email archive showing exactly what your communication style is. Third thing, you start asking Marcus for written feedback after meetings. Just a quick follow-up email. Thanks for the discussion. Just want to make sure I capture your feedback accurately. Could you drop me a note with the main points? Marcus does this. He's thorough like that, and what you notice is that his written feedback is noticeably warmer and more specific than his verbal feedback in reviews. Because in writing, he's drawing on what he can actually observe. In verbal reviews, he'd been drawing on what he'd been told. By month 20, you've got a clean paper trail of your actual work performance, documented client outcomes, communication records, management feedback that consistently rates you well on the things that can be measured. And you've got a separate log of the concerns that have been materializing in your reviews, always vague, always sourced to the team or some stakeholders, never documented, never specific. The two pictures don't match at all. And any HR person worth their salt is going to see that immediately. What you're missing is the source. You can show the damage. You can show the pattern. But you can't prove who's been feeding Marcus the soft narrative. Not yet. You need one more thing. One piece. So here's where things get genuinely tense. Month 21. Greystone has just gone through a restructure. Small one, not dramatic, but the kind that reshuffles priorities and makes management suddenly very focused on performance metrics. Marcus tells the team that everyone's going to have a comprehensive annual review in the next quarter. He says it warmly, like it's a development opportunity. You hear it differently. Because you've had 2 bad reviews. Both with vague sourcing. Both with a gap between the verbal tone and the written record. And a 3rd bad review, particularly in a restructure context, starts to feel like a different kind of problem. You need to work on your communication style. We're going to have to make some changes. You know the work is good. Your documentation proves it, but you also know that 2 years of narrative damage is hard to undo in one review cycle, and if Rachel has been quietly feeding Marcus concerns for 21 months, there's a version of this where the pattern she's built is just believed. Where communication challenges has become the established story about you, and the actual evidence becomes the thing that's questioned. You're 4 weeks from the review. You have a thorough paper trail and no smoking gun. And you're starting to genuinely wonder if the documentation is going to be enough. And then it's Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. Your inbox pings. So okay, here's what actually happened. And I need you to picture this, like really picture it, because the specificity is the thing. Rachel has a habit of managing a separate private thread with Marcus for what she calls team health updates. You don't know this thread exists. Marcus has never mentioned it. It's the kind of channel that's technically not against policy, just a manager and a senior AM talking about the team, but it's also the kind of channel that, if you knew it existed and were then copied into it accidentally, would contain the full narrative history of what had been happening. On this particular Tuesday, Rachel wants to send Marcus an update about a client situation. But she also wants to add a note. This is what you eventually read about how she's continuing to observe the performance pattern she'd flagged and thinks the upcoming review is the right time to formalize the concern. She types the email. She hits reply. Except the last email she'd been working on before switching tabs was a client update where you'd been CC'd. The context thread is still active. She doesn't notice. She hits send. Your inbox pings at 2:47 p.m. The subject line reads, Meridian Client Update, Week 4 Follow-up. Normal. Completely normal. You click it because you're working on Meridian. And there it is. They nested below the client update thread, Rachel's note to Marcus. And below that, Marcus's reply from 6 weeks ago. And below that, another exchange from 4 months ago. 3 layers of private communication that you were never meant to see, accidentally attached to a routine client email, sitting in your inbox on a Tuesday afternoon. You read it once fast. Your brain doesn't catch everything. You read it again slower. And then you read it a 3rd time carefully and you start to understand what you're holding. It's not just one email. It's a thread. It's a months-long thread. And in it, Rachel has been documenting her concerns about you, not the vague paraphrased version that made it into your reviews, but the actual source material. Specific dates, specific framings, the exact language she'd been using to describe you to Marcus tends to operate outside the team framework. Has a pattern of going directly to clients without team alignment. The junior team members are struggling to connect with her working style. You've got the source. Right there, in your inbox. By accident. You forward the thread to your personal email. Timestamp, 2:51 p.m. You close your laptop. You go to the bathroom and stand at the sink for about 3 minutes. You wash your hands twice, which you don't need to do, but you do it anyway because your hands need something to be doing. Then you go back to your desk. You reopen the laptop. You open a new document. And you start building the file you're going to take to HR. You request a meeting with HR the following morning. You don't tell anyone you're doing it. You don't tell Marcus. You don't tell Priya. You go to the HR office, which is on a different floor, at 9:30 a.m. on a Wednesday with a document folder that contains the accidentally forwarded email thread, your complete personal log of 23 incidents over 21 months, your personal archive of CC client communications showing your actual performance, and the written feedback from Marcus, the warmer measurement-based written feedback that doesn't match the verbal review narrative. The HR director is a man named David Okafor. You've spoken to him exactly once before at an all-company event, and he seemed thoughtful. He lives up to that first impression. He reads through everything you hand him, takes his time, asks clarifying questions that tell you he's actually tracking the argument you're making rather than processing it for liability management. He asks if you have any additional documentation. You produce the BCC archive from your personal email, 20 months of client communications, time-stamped, showing your actual communication style in real time. David looks at it for a while. Then he says, I want to request the complete communication record between Ms. Nguyen and Mr. Webb. Can you give me a day? You say yes. He says, thank you for the way you've documented this. It makes our job significantly easier. You say, okay, thank you. You leave his office. You go back to your desk. You spend the rest of the day doing work. Normal, regular, completely ordinary work, while somewhere on a different floor David Okafor is reading 2 years of something you've been living without knowing it. The investigation takes 12 days. During those 12 days you don't tell anyone. You work normally. You have a regular Thursday coffee with Rachel because canceling would be conspicuous. She talks about the upcoming review cycle and mentions that she thinks Marcus has a really holistic picture of the team this year. She uses that word, holistic. You smile and say that sounds good. You go back to your desk. You add an entry to your log, date, time, comment about holistic picture, contexts. On day 12, David calls you back in. He has a colleague with him this time, Greystone's legal counsel, which tells you something before anyone says a word. What? They found, when they pulled the full communication thread between Rachel and Marcus, 47 messages over 22 months. In those 47 messages, Rachel had submitted 31 separate observations about your performance. Of those 31, 26 contained no verifiable basis. They were assertions, impressions, framings without documentation. 4 of them referenced specific client situations, and in 3 of those 4 cases, when cross-referenced with the actual client records, the account of events Rachel had provided to Marcus was demonstrably incomplete or inaccurate. One of them had been fabricated wholesale, the client concern about a specific meeting that, per the client's own records, had never been raised. Fabricated. They misremembered. Not exaggerated. One specific piece of evidence that Rachel had submitted to your manager in writing about you was something she had made up. Rachel was put on administrative leave the same day. That part happens fast, faster than the investigation did, once the conclusion was clear. She was gone from the office before end of business on a Wednesday. That evening, Marcus sent you a message asking if you had time for a conversation the next day. Marcus's conversation with you on that Thursday morning is the one where he has to do the hardest version of a manager's job. He'd been fed information for nearly 2 years. He'd acted on it in good faith, mostly. He'd let it shape how he saw you, how he talked about you in reviews, how he weighted your work against Rachel's framing. And now he had to sit across from you and account for that. He does it well, actually. You'd expected defensive and you got genuinely accountable. He says, I should have pushed harder for specifics. When I couldn't source the feedback concretely, I should have told you that rather than repeating impressions as if they were facts. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. He says this without the but that usually follows apologies in corporate settings. Just the clean version of it. You respect that. You genuinely do. Rachel spent 22 months feeding fabricated and mischaracterized information about you to your manager. One of those pieces of information was completely invented. Your career trajectory at Greystone, your performance reviews, your standing with management, your shot at a promotion that went to someone else 18 months in was shaped by something that wasn't true. Rachel's employment at Greystone was terminated. The decision was made after consultation between HR and legal. She had a reputation in the industry that was, from what you later hear through the usual channels, significantly harder to manage after the circumstances of her departure became known in the way these things always do. You didn't need to tell anyone. You didn't? She'd built her career within a career on a foundation that a Tuesday reply all dismantled in one email. Rachel was gone. The record had been corrected. You're still at Greystone. Not because you had to stay. After all of this, Marcus made clear you could write your own transition if you wanted it. You stayed because the job was still what it had always been before Rachel's interference. Good work, good clients, a manager who, having been badly played once, was now almost comically thorough about sourcing feedback. Their thoroughness is annoying sometimes in the way that overcorrection always is. You'll take it over the alternative. The promotion came through 14 months after Rachel left. Not as a consolation, or at least you don't read it that way. It came because the work was there, the documentation was there, and the noise that had been clouding the signal for 2 years was gone. Marcus wrote your recommendation. He was specific in it. He cited the client retention work from your first 6 months, the work you did before any of the review noise started, and said it was the benchmark the team still used. Priya got promoted 6 months before you did to senior AM. You genuinely celebrated that. She'd earned it, she'd always been going to earn it, and you like her a lot more now that you're officially peers. Here's the thing about 2 years of quietly bad performance reviews. The damage isn't just professional, it's internal. You spent 2 years wondering if something was broken in you that other people could see and you couldn't. That's not easy to shake, even after the evidence is in and the record's corrected. You still have moments, in reviews, in feedback conversations, even in client meetings, where you catch yourself bracing for the version of yourself that Rachel built. The one that doesn't exist but felt real for 22 months. That version isn't you. You know that now. The paper trail always knew it. Sometimes you just need the documentation to outlast the noise. Okay, so here's what I want from you before you close this. Not a like, not even a subscribe. Well, honestly, yes, the subscribe, but that's not the point right now. Here's what I'm genuinely thinking about after spending time with this story. The 23 things you logged over 21 months. The BCC archive. The written feedback requests. The whole careful, quiet apparatus of proof you built. While sitting next to someone at Thursday coffee and smiling. While doing the work and doing it well. While carrying 2 years of quietly being told you weren't who you knew you were. That kind of patience is actually rare. And I want to know if you've ever had to do something like that. Not revenge, documentation. Building the case while the damage was still happening. Staying in the room. That's the thing that stays with me about this story. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you know someone who's in the middle of something like this right now, someone who keeps getting told the work isn't landing when they know it is, share this with them. Not for the revenge angle, for the documentation angle. And because the paper trail always wins. It just takes time. Last week, a story about a landlord who tried to keep a $2,800 security deposit by inventing damage that wasn't there. Except the tenant had done a move-in walkthrough on video. Every room, 9 minutes of footage. The small claims judge's face when the video was submitted is, I'm told something to behold. That one's coming Thursday. These are the stories nobody planned to tell. That's why they feel the way they do.